Hello and welcome to another podcast from the IDRiM Society. Today, I've got Dr. Simon Dickinson from the University of Plymouth. So, in today's episode, what we're going to focus on is Simon's research, which he published back in last April, which was titled Watching the Disaster Unfold, Geographies of Engagement with Live Stream Extreme Weather Events. So welcome, Simon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Today, my first question, when I was reading about this, and I really did enjoy this paper, in your paper, you discuss the increased number of extreme weather events being live streamed on the platform, like YouTube. So what draw your attention to this specific media engagement with natural disasters or natural hazards?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the question. I've got quite a personal connection actually to this particular project and paper and my kind of broader research area. So a few years ago when I was doing my PhD here in the UK, so I'm from New Zealand, and I got a text message from some family members in New Zealand, and there'd been a kind of offshore earthquake and a subsequent sort of tsunami alert for the kind of eastern coast of the South Island of New Zealand. And at the time it was the middle of the night in New Zealand, and I was kind of in the library here doing some writing on my PhD. And I kind of popped online and realized that very quickly I could kind of access all sorts of information about that particular context. I could see webcams of sort of like beach surf cams where, in the areas that were potentially going to be hit by the tsunami in due course. And because I was messaging slightly older members of my family, they weren't kind of engaged with the same resources. They didn't have the thought to sort of pop online and have a look at this. So what I found myself doing in that situation, although there wasn't much to say, was I was kind of relaying different kinds of information to my family members who weren't at immediate risk, but had been told that an event was imminent. So at that stage, my PhD was on a different element of kind of disasters and disaster risk. But it sort of planted the seed where I was like, well, actually, I'm thousands of miles away from this event, but as it plays out, I'm still a part of it. I'm still participating in it. And in some ways, not that I was hugely helpful in that instance, but I was able to give information to people kind of going through that event. So that kind of planted that seed, and I started to look a little bit more at the different kinds of content, video, live streaming, social media sort of content that was out there as these events sort of play out in real time.
Yeah, so did it actually help you in some respects, or in like a psychological respect, that you could see what was coming even though you're thousands of miles away and obviously will have some concern about your family?
Yeah, I mean, it is worth acknowledging that event, that there was a tsunami alert. The tsunami did not eventuate, or if it did, it was incredibly small and had no kind of significant impact. I think what sort of caught my attention at that point was partly a slightly voyeuristic kind of instinct of I can watch things happen here, watching water, seeing if the water was receding. But partly, as you say, kind of psychological. I'm there, I'm giving information, I'm kind of talking with my family members in the middle of the night, New Zealand time. So although my kind of research has started to show that for other people, it can be an important mechanism through which people can participate, offer support, communicate, these sorts of things. I think in this instance, it was, a relatively insignificant event. It was more just being able to kind of talk and kind of communicate with people in the moment.
Yeah, so I mean, I did an interview with Dr. Rahadianto about 2 or 3 weeks ago now, and when we were talking about it, it was an irony, is that this style about watching the disaster unfold is actually the thing that actually got me involved into disasters in the first place. So I was 12 years old, and I remember Hurricane Katrina. So this was before the advent of YouTube, but even still, we had CNN at that point, and you could literally watch it unfold. And I remember even at 12 years old, by being gripped by this, and you just wanted to watch, and you couldn't. It was almost like an addiction, I would say, that you just did not want to stop watching it, even though you knew what was happening and how it was impacting people. You just couldn't stop, and it's almost a weird, and some might say a sick addiction, but it's really, I don't know why, but it just drawed me into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that was almost my starting point in some ways. And I think people kind of often ask me, particularly with this study and this kind of area of work that I do, well, what's your sort of research problem, or what's your sort of research challenge? And I think for me, if you were kind of looking at the sort of footage that is available online, both during an event and after it, we've all kind of gone online and looked at tornadoes and hurricanes and storm damage. Or if we haven't done that, we've been to the movies and seen Twister or Twisters in the last couple of years, or whatever other kind of sort of slightly apocalyptic event. And we are, I think, probably inherently and psychologically in some way all driven to watching extreme, slightly awe-inspiring events. And I think that is a big part of what attracts a lot of people to live streams of hurricanes and storms and tornadoes, is that kind of hope, that slightly voyeuristic kind of hope that we will watch something significant, potentially catastrophic, unfold. But kind of the crux to this particular paper is that while all of that might be going on, actually there's all sorts of other interesting connections and geographies and rationales for why people might be watching this kind of footage also going on at the exact same time. So yeah, I can really empathize with your comments of being drawn to that kind of footage, because I think there's something about that inside all of us in one way or other.
I do have some maybe very basic questions to all this one, and like as Mark also mentions, and your actual starting point, actually you are being engaged by these events unfold in front of you. Do you, in your opinion, do you think this kind of engagements also occurring when people witnessing a live sports event, for example, or entertainment event? And do you find any similarities or differences? Because like of course the events may be totally different, but as people is actually wants to keep watching, do you find there is some similarities between the research that you've done with people witnessing more entertainment style live streaming like that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. There's a couple of ways I would kind of speak to that. So I think, firstly, as I briefly touched upon it a minute or two ago, there's something about something being live, being unfolding, being kind of, and often marketed as kind of like unfiltered, that we are naturally drawn to, I think. And I think there are probably similarities with sports fans and watching sport, is that you're watching because you don't yet know what's going to happen. It could be spectacular, it might not be. So for example, last night I watched a football match, and putting my cards on the table, I'm not a football fan. I wasn't a fan of either of the teams playing, but I knew it was a big match, and what drew me to it was it could be spectacular. It could be a kind of moment that is sort of seminal or kind of important in football or kind of sport more broadly. So I think there is something that draws us to live footage, because we might see and might be a part of something that is culturally or socially significant. I think also another way of kind of thinking about your question is, we often watch, particularly with sport and entertainment, we watch that footage because we have an emotional connection to the team, to the place it's taking part in, or perhaps, we've got some sort of emotional connection because we know the story, or whatever the kind of entertainment event might be. And there is a similarity there, I think, with this kind of live hazard footage, because as this sort of paper discusses, is that often these streams and these kind of live beach cams or whatever it might be, they're watched by people who have connections to the people and the places that are being affected by this particular event. So, you might be on the other side of the world, thousands of miles away, as I was in the case of New Zealand and the tsunami alert. And I want to be able to practice and that connection. I want to be able to see the place and the people. And I've got no other kind of mechanism or way of doing that. So this kind of live footage is a way in which I can kind of perform and practice that connection. So I think to answer your kind of, very clear question in a number of different ways, I think there are similarities, both in terms of the liveness, the unfoldingness, but also that kind of emotional connection that we have with people, places, teams, whatever it might be.
So when I was reading the paper, so kind of got a broad introduction to it and motivation. So I was just thinking about your research methodology. Could you walk us through, the methodology you use to analyze and view it into action during the live streams?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's probably worth acknowledging my broad research area, which kind of comes through in this paper, but also in other contexts, is I'm really interested in moments of potential disaster, moments of hazards playing out, moments, I guess, of potential catastrophe, impending doom, to use kind of slightly stronger language. I'm really interested in what people are talking about in those moments and kind of how they are making sense of quite big and quite abstract ideas like climate change and vulnerability and risk, and kind of where risk comes from. So how do people kind of talk about those ideas and make sense of them in these moments of potential catastrophe, or in their eyes, perhaps societal breakdown? So what that kind of means in terms of the methods I use, both in this study and others, is I spend a lot of time in and around these events, kind of in online spaces. So it's almost a form of kind of participant observation, where these kind of communities pop up. They're quite ephemeral. They don't tend to last too long. They might be around live streams. They might be on particular kind of Discord pages or other social media sites. And essentially, I'll spend a long period of time within those communities, sometimes being relatively covert, just sitting there, not commenting, just observing what's playing out. And in other times, I will kind of actively participate in these communities, either because I have a connection to the place or the people, or I will acknowledge that I'm a researcher. So I'm kind of in these online spaces as they play out, often for large periods of time. So in the case of hurricane live streams, they tend to start very early on, often days before kind of landfall. So I will often spend days, periods of time, 12 hours, have a sleep, go back the next day, or whatever it might be, kind of looking at these communities, how they develop, how they work, the relationships between the kind of the comment spaces and then the visual elements. Essentially, it's trying to get some sort of sense of immersion in these kind of digital communities as they sort of form and change around these events.
Okay, so could you detail then the process and the criteria used to select the events you've used? So you've used Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Ian, and the 2022 UK storms. So, what made these events stand out for your study?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think this was the first study, I think, for me in this area, but also generally looking at live streams of hazards. So I've subsequently looked at a much bigger range of events. But I think what kind of drew me, the sampling strategy, for a better word, was partly dictated in this paper by the kind of the event. So in this instance, they were all hurricanes or storms, which had relatively predictable and long kind of lead-in periods. So what that meant was a lot of online live stream infrastructure kind of popped up in and around these events in the days leading up to them. So no matter kind of how specific or vapid your YouTube search histories were, particularly around Hurricane Irma, if you were to go to the YouTube homepage or Discord homepage, you would see either one of these videos or kind of links to sort of live footage of these events. So I guess the sampling strategy for this particular paper was those events with the long kind of lead-in times. They were also seen as relatively significant. So in those early days, they were predicted to be either the most catastrophic or significant events of that season or of that year. The UK event was sort of unique in the sense of it was 3 storms which struck within quick succession of one another. So there was a lot of kind of media coverage of that. And I think one of the kind of implications of that was that they just had a lot of online kind of activity and chatter and channels in and around that. So they're not designed to be a kind of representative sample as such, but they were kind of channels where, because of that lead-in time, because of their supposed significance or potential catastrophicness, they just had a really big and kind of obvious online presence around them.
Can it be considered as citizen science? Now, there are many buzzwords on the disaster, especially when we're streaming the hazard unfolds. It's like, oh, we should use the citizen science. And this kind of research, in your sense, can it be considered a citizen science? And if yes, or if no, for whatever it is, like how you prospect this research going forward in the future?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I often think about that actually, as I spend so long kind of talking about and almost justifying the kind of importance of live streams, and their importance in my eyes is in part because of the amount of people engaging with them. So many of these streams will have hundreds of thousands of live simultaneous viewers. They last for long periods of time. The videos are kind of watched millions of times. So some of the videos that were used in the analysis for this particular study have been viewed, individually 10 or 20 million times. So really, really widely engaged with kind of resources. So I think it's a very kind of logical and natural question as well. Is there a way of kind of harnessing that viewership? And I guess I've got sort of 2 answers to that, neither of which are kind of hugely definitive. So I think, firstly, before we kind of get to citizen science, we can already acknowledge that streams and live video of hazards and hazard events, they are already wrapped up in the kind of management of the event. So these are particular kind of high profile and extreme examples, but for example, during Hurricane Ian, there was a case where there was a beach cam and someone was kind of swept by a wave off a kind of promenade pier sort of area into the sea. And of course, people kind of called emergency services as a result of that. Now, not to say that they were the only people who saw it and that they were the only people that called emergency services, but what's really interesting is that people are participating in the event, and that's contributing to the management and response of it in some way. Similarly, I might come back to this in a second in regards to the future, live streams are increasingly becoming a tool used by emergency responders and emergency managers, both to manage and reduce risk, but also as a kind of an Internet of Things type resource where we have access to see different places and things which might kind of shape response. So that doesn't quite answer the citizen science question, but I think it's really interesting that these are wrapped up in how we manage and respond. I think to try and answer your question a little bit more exactly or specifically, I haven't quite got my head around how it becomes citizen science, because I think there's huge potential here. We've got a huge number of people watching different kinds of video. What I'm trying to do with my work is understand more about why people are there and how they're using these spaces. And I guess one of the, I don't like to use the word, but it is true, one of the limitations of this study is that it actually engages with a very small and particular part of the user base, people who are commenting and using the kind of comment spaces. And although I've kind of trawled through this paper and others, tens of thousands of users, hundreds of thousands of comments related to different events, that is a small proportion of people who are actually watching this. So I guess after kind of detailing for 5 minutes or so to get to your actual questions, there's potential there, and haven't quite yet got my head round what that might look like from a citizen science perspective, because you're right, we've got this kind of huge number of people really sort of engaged and interested, and in particular interested in concepts and things that are usually way down people's priority lists. And the question is, well, does that therefore become a resource that we can kind of use in some way? I think the answer is yes, but I'm just not quite sure sort of how.
So you mentioned just now about engaging and participating and how people comment in, but also in your paper you mentioned the concept of committed viewing. Could you elaborate on how this forms of an engagement impacts the viewer's experience and perception of the event?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think going back to what we were speaking a little bit about before, I came in, and I think a lot of people would, with this sort of expectation that people are watching or drawn to these live streams and drawn to these videos to watch things go crash and bang, to watch, the spectacular, perhaps the awe-inspiring, or the unusual happen. And of course, that is a big motivation for some people. But as I was starting to analyze these videos and these streams and kind of working in these spaces, a couple of things struck me that sort of didn't quite fit with that. And I think it's first really important to acknowledge that a lot of these streams, they're incredibly boring. They often are set up in the kind of lead up to events. So, days before a hurricane makes landfall, or when a particular tornado warning or whatever it might be has been sent out, or, if there's seismic activity around a volcano and there's just cameras fixed on a mound from a far distance. So they're incredibly mundane. They're often not centered on they rely on existing infrastructure a lot of the time. So they're not focused on the center of the event often. They're kind of just showing a beach or whatever it might be miles away. The funny thing about natural hazards is they don't play by the rules of daylight. So often, these events take place during the middle of the night when everything's dark. And also, funnily enough, hurricanes and storms tend to bring rain with them, and rain is not good for video footage. And so often you're just watching streams of slightly blurry footage at night with water droplets on the camera. But what was really interesting to me is that a lot of people were kind of staying and talking and communicating through all of this. And so the immediate question was, well, actually, people must be here for something else. And so one of the kind of groups, or one of the practices I came across in my analysis, which I used the term committed viewers for, and that was a term used by one of these users, were people who were kind of drawn to the event, and their intention or their rationale for being there was to kind of watch that event in its entirety, or at least to be there for a kind of really significant period of time. And for people who kind of practiced this, it was almost a way of kind of being there. It was a way of showing support, showing empathy. It's almost although the words weren't used, it was almost sort of framed as an act of kind of sacrifice, where I'm giving up time in my day, I'm giving up thought or activity, whatever it might be, to kind of sit here and sort of be with people in the community, to be with the place affected, and inherently kind of hope that nothing happens. And so I sort of use the term anti-spectacle a couple of times in the paper, in the sense that it runs quite counter to what that initial thought of why people might be there. It's that people are there hoping that nothing happens and that nothing continues to happen. And so it's a slightly different kind of relationship with the stream, with the video, with the community. And yeah, there's that kind of that intention to show support, to show engagement, to show solidarity, to kind of in ways that aren't really otherwise possible. If I'm on the other side of the world, if it's a people or a place that I care about, there's little I can do. But perhaps for some people, giving up time and mental thought becomes a way of showing that solidarity, or at least practicing it.
As looking for extending on this, as when suddenly the big or devastating hazards comes along, when the discommitted viewers watch their live streams, of course it become like more people join it, right? Let's say the common people that's not committed or whatever. And do you observe any interesting discussions in their comments between this committed viewers and the people who just jump in when the big event just unfolds? And perhaps after that, do you feel any increase in the number of committed viewers, or something else that, okay, like this is the problem that we have, we observe this and maybe we can improve on this, because like in some experience that I have, usually after people, well, this kind of political events, and like people it goes to the government giving up petitions because like they're witnessing something live that's devastating in front of them. I'm not sure whether you observe the after effects of the viewing, but do you think there will be some kind of, let's say, movement or some activities that can spark from watching joining this live streamings and engaging with the committed viewers?
Yeah, really good question. I think there's kind of a few interesting ways to a few interesting things to pick up there. I think firstly, kind of picking up on your question or point of, well, how do committed viewers and people who've been there for a while engage with the influx of people, particularly around the kind of more catastrophic moments? And there are definite peaks and troughs, and peaks are around the most catastrophic moments. But also, in the case of the UK storms, one of the streams was shown on BBC News Live, and immediately you could just see thousands of people, kind of the numbers went up. It's not necessarily, committed viewers and non, but what's really interesting to me about these spaces is that they have hierarchies to them, as most kind of social media kind of spaces do. Some people have more or less authority than others. And that authority in these spaces, with YouTube comment spaces or Discord or, other kind of even places like Twitch and Patreon, where we have kind of live stream footage in different ways, that authority can kind of come from or emerge in different ways. So sometimes authority might be because someone has been there for a longer period of time, so they can comment on how conditions have changed. Or that authority might come from someone saying that they hold a particular professional background or education. And of course, there's no way of validating that, but people bring in, they say, oh, well, I'm a retired meteorologist, for example. So really commonly in these spaces, someone will ask a question, and then you might see someone respond saying, oh, that's a great question. You need to wait for insert username to respond. And it's that kind of hierarchy playing out where people are recognizing there's communities building, people are occupying kind of different positions within that community. And that can build kind of perspectives or perceptions of whose voice is more or less valid in speaking to things. And certainly it works the other way too, where sometimes people will come in and say, oh, this looks really bad, it's going to be terrible. And they'll be accused of, say, fear-mongering, because someone might say, you haven't been here, you haven't been commenting, we've been here for 8 hours, and it's exactly the same. So it kind of works both ways as well. I think also your question sort of touched upon, well, what happens after the event? And I wish I knew more about this, because this is a kind of a really big unknown for me, and a really big interesting kind of part of this is that we have these moments where we have hundreds of thousands of people coming together, kind of talking, discussing, or watching kind of without commenting. And it's really hard to know about what that actually means in terms of longer term communities, or maybe risk knowledges or event knowledges, or kind of what they actually take away from that, both in terms of knowledge and action. I think it's really hard, particularly in context of YouTube, to figure that out, because the stream just ceases to exist. Sometimes the video isn't even archived and uploaded, it just disappears. It's a little bit easier with sites like Discord, where people can subscribe to communities in those moments, and then they are still a part of those communities. So I'm only starting to kind of dig into this a little bit, but particularly with kind of Twitch and Discord and even Patreon, which is another kind of discussion in of itself, because people are subscribing, they do come back. They are kind of participating, and there's those sort of reflective discussions going on about the event, about how it kind of worked, and people are kind of bringing in other stuff after the kind of fact. So it doesn't quite answer your question, but I guess it's a big sort of research question mark for me as well. How do I assess, and how do I examine or see or observe kind of what goes on beyond the event itself?
Yeah, your answer actually gives me two more questions, so I'll go for one of them. How do these live stream interactions contribute to or challenge existing theories of social media engagement during disasters?
That is an excellent question. So I think what stands out for me, and this both, I think, fits in with some understanding of kind of social media use in disasters, but also kind of offers a new perspective, is I think if I'm asked to kind of summarize what people get from these streams that they don't get elsewhere, it's interactivity. And although the rationales for that might differ, what tends to be drawing people to these streams is that they can get something from this that they can't get elsewhere. And I've got a paper under review at the moment which looked at specifically questions people were asking in the live streams during Hurricanes Helene and Milton last year, which affected parts of the Caribbean and the United States. Looking at ended up being about 16,000 comments over these kind of questions, over these live streams. And what the key thing that stood out for me is that people are there because, yes, they might want to watch things go crash and burn. They are there for all this kind of emotional sort of connection stuff, but they're also there asking really specific questions, sometimes down to the level of, I am here. Should I relocate? Should I evacuate? Or my family is in X. I haven't heard from them. Is it bad there? And at the same time, people are asking bigger questions about hazards. So during Helene and Milton, one of the kind of sort of semi-unique characteristics were that we saw tornadoes at the same time as a kind of hurricane. And there's a relationship between those. But people are asking all sorts of questions about, well, is this normal? Do we see these things playing out at the same time? And then there's also people there asking, I've been told by government officials that I should relocate in 24 hours. Do you think I can do it in 36? Or do you think I'll be absolutely fine if I stay? And so to kind of return to your question, kind of what brings all of those really diverse things together is that it is a place to get information in ways that they can't get from elsewhere. And that's not me suggesting that emergency managers and responders should be there answering those questions, of course. But I think what this offers that even kind of previous sort of social medias like Twitter or X or Facebook or whatever it might be doesn't get is all of this stuff coming together in a kind of live way even Facebook and Twitter aren't live in the same way. I think it gives us an insight into what people are asking and what they want in these moments and what they're kind of interested in talking about in a way that maybe other technologies and other kind of social media in the past might have done slightly differently. I think that's probably my response.
But doesn't that also run the risk of misinformation, though? Because if you don't know, as you mentioned, you don't know who's who's within that community. Somebody might be portraying that they are an expert and advising people the wrong way. Isn't that also the bigger threat of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one thing that I don't want to do as part of this discussion and more broadly is paint them as utopian kind of spaces where everyone is coming together with some kind of form of greater good in mind. I think it's worth acknowledging that, as you might imagine, that in amongst all of the stuff that I've spoken about today also is your sadly to be expected, vile, kind of very kind of political stuff that makes its way through whatever moderation is kind of going on in that space. And earlier I was speaking about the kind of the banality and the mundaneness of these videos, the kind of the backdrop kind of forming or contributing to the conversation that's going on. And of course, some of that conversation is misinformation. It is kind of people talking erroneously about climate change or kind of about the politics of things. So I think for me, that is in part the research problem or challenge here, is that we can say relatively definitively, increasingly around any event, more live streams are accessible or available, and increasingly more people are watching them. So therefore, there's a kind of an imperative to understand what's happening in here. And although we see a little bit of those kind of hierarchies that I spoke about, which they actually do police some of that misinformation, and people are accused of either fearmongering or kind of giving incorrect information, that does go on. These are inherently also spaces of where the seeds of kind of misinformation are sown too.
You mentioned earlier about BBC News showing one of the live streams of one of the UK storms. And actually, when I was reading your paper, I actually had this thought that came up because I noticed that here in the UK, BBC and Sky are doing this more frequently on their own pages as well as on YouTube. But I was thinking, how might viewer insight on viewer engagements, with live streams and extreme weather events influence future media practices, but also how it might influence emergency response strategies to these events?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think a couple of things sort of pop into my mind there. I think, as we've been talking about over the last few minutes, one of the kind of defining characteristics of that drives engagement with these sorts of medias is that they offer a form of interactivity that people aren't getting elsewhere. And that's not me necessarily suggesting that media needs to go out and create these interactive spaces, but acknowledging that there's something about that live playing out kind of events that communities want to form in and around that. So sometimes it is about what's playing out, but sometimes it's also about having a space where kind of people can kind of come together and talk about those things. So I guess the kind of dominant theme there is, well, how can media sort of acknowledge the want or the desire for interactivity? And that, of course, raises all sorts of really big questions about moderation, about the appropriateness of media doing that, etc. I think what's also important to acknowledge, although it doesn't answer your question exactly, is that kind of in today's sort of climate, political and social climate, there is an inherent suspicion of kind of news framings of various sorts of backgrounds and biases and all of these sorts of things. And what's interesting is that I think, or at least I have evidence of through this study, of some people are drawn to these videos because they offer a supposed neutral view. Now, that neutral view may not be hugely interesting or exciting, and some of us might look at it and question, well, what does neutrality actually mean in this context? But that is an appealing kind of characteristic of a live unfolding video rather than a packaged news story that kind of media might be offering. I think more from a kind of an emergency management side of things, it is worth acknowledging that live streaming is increasingly becoming a part of risk management and emergency response. So it's yet to make its way into the UK, although there have been discussions around it. It's very common in other parts of the world, New Zealand and Australia, I'm sure about, where kind of they have sort of hazard hubs online, which are kind of risk information sources where you can log on and see warnings and, traffic disruption and all of those sorts of things. And increasingly live streamed, almost just like webcam traffic footage, but perhaps footage of a bridge over a river. That live kind of video is becoming a tool to communicate risk to people and kind of hopefully inform kind of people's risk taking practices. So that, in kind of collaboration with sort of the Internet of Things style, where emergency services now through video technologies have access to places, to homes, to neighborhoods, these sorts of things. Increasingly, it's just live videos becoming wrapped up in how events are managed.
So just thinking as well, and you kind of touch up on this when you were talking about the methodology, but what were the main challenges you faced in gathering, analyzing the data from these live streams? But also, how do you address the ethical concerns, given how sensitive nature of the content could be, observed during this? Because people obviously are going to have, it might be in this, our family in this, and that is, quite sensitive, even though it isn't a public space.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as I discussed a little bit earlier, as you mentioned, the key, the big sort of methodological challenge for me here is that comment spaces are a small proportion of people working and operating in these spaces. So what I have a window of is a particular type of person or type of user who wants to actively participate in these communities. And I can't quantify how many that is because the numbers are fluctuating so often in terms of how many people are watching and when. Inevitably, a very significant proportion of people are there. They might be watching and kind of consuming the conversation, but they're not actively participating in it. So the big question for me is trying to engage with people who are there, but for whatever reason don't want to contribute to those communities. So there's a huge number of things that I've been trying to get around it, ranging from kind of setting up my own streaming infrastructure, where obviously I have a greater oversight of when people are there and how many, etc., to working with different kind of streaming websites and channels when they kind of crop up, seeing if I can post information around particular research projects or, to link to a questionnaire, for example, how to do that. So yeah, there's a number of ways I'm trying to get around that, but I haven't yet sort of solved that conundrum. I think the ethical question is a super interesting one. And I guess there's a couple of different ways of looking at it. And one of those is that, perhaps slightly kind of technically or kind of emotionlessly, these are public spaces. These are conversations playing out in public. So ethics in that sense of the word, these are kind of public kind of databases of sorts. But of course, as you have kind of acknowledged and as I've spoken about, you have people kind of working and operating in these spaces who are in the immediacy of the event, or who are checking up on friends or family who they think are in the immediacy of the event, or even if they're kind of geographically removed, are still emotionally kind of affected by these events. And so I think, although this might feel slightly vague, but it's remaining sensitive to the fact of just not stumbling in and saying, I'm a researcher, I'm observing you, here's a link to a questionnaire, would you please fill it in? Recognizing that these are spaces where there's all sorts of kind of emotionally important and heavy, in some instances kind of life or death situations where people are kind of coming in contact with one another. So I think it's just being attuned to that, being reflexive and acknowledging that at different points, people are there for very different reasons, and different kinds of people with different proximities are there too.
Okay, and finally, where do you see the potential for future research in the area of live streaming and viewer engagement is going to go? In particular, because I've noticed that you've mainly focused just on storms at the minute. Do you see this extend out into different crisis situations like earthquakes or tsunamis, as you mentioned previously, or even volcanic activity?
Yeah, really interesting question. So I'll answer that in two slightly different ways. I think your kind of point there about event type, absolutely. So naturally, as we've spoken about, these streams tend to operate around events which have observable and kind of definable lead-in times, storms, hurricanes, etc. Earthquakes, obviously that becomes slightly more difficult. There are live streams around volcanoes, which I've been analyzing as part of a linked sort of project. And there's certainly in different parts of the world as we speak, kind of many streams about volcanoes. So I guess one way of answering that question is yes, expanding the kind of hazard type and starting to look at different dynamics going on there. For me, though, perhaps predominantly what my interest is in and the direction is going is thinking firstly about the kinds of streams that are available. So there's some work that I'm doing at the moment, which in the kind of the aftermath of the Southern California wildfires, looking at people streaming from home devices, so home security cameras and smart doorbells. So I've just been in the States doing some research looking at how people sort of, when they are removed or relocated from their homes, are using video tech from their doorbells, both to observe their home perhaps being burnt or damaged, but also perhaps making decisions about whether to relocate home through that kind of visual footage. So there's a kind of strand there thinking about the expanding types of streams that are available kind of in and around these events. What's also interesting to me, kind of connected to that, is how people are using footage from these streams in quite creative ways. So on social media, people are beginning to kind of do all sorts of interesting things in and around hazards on TikTok, on X, on other kind of platforms where they might be using footage from streams and kind of talking over that footage about the event. So what's really interesting for me is that suddenly the footage can be repurposed and has a kind of a cultural currency in social media spaces where people are sharing their experiences. I was looking at some kind of accounts yesterday where people were packing emergency bags, and kind of behind that was video of kind of previous storms. And you'd think that's a really boring thing to do, but for whatever reason, that has a following. And there is some form of kind of creative or cultural capital or currency in sort of using that and talking about that online. So I think moving forward, it's about hazards, but it's also about types of streams available and how that footage is being used after the event as well.
Thank you, Simon. I'm sure myself and Harris could have asked you questions all day, but because of time, we'll have to finish there. And I hope our viewers enjoyed today, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks.